For over a decade, Edward, a British man who traded the foggy mornings of London for the bustling suburbs of New Jersey, thought he had settled into the American dream. His life was ordinary, even predictable. Work, family dinners, and weekend walks through his neighborhood lined with maple trees. Yet just beyond the white picket fence, there was something, or rather, someone, that stirred unease. Edward's neighbor, Mr. Collins, was the kind of man who never waved, never joined the block barbecues, and never let anyone too close. Curtains drawn, porch lights flickering at odd hours, and a gaze that seemed to linger a second too long. It was the type of presence that made even the friendliest streets feel like the set of a thriller. At first, Edward dismissed it as cultural differences. After all, he knew Americans sometimes found the British a bit too formal, too private. But there was something about Mr. Collins's silence that wasn't just reserved. It was watchful. Neighbors whispered, speculated, and even avoided walking past his house at night. Then came the winter storm. Snow buried driveways, sealed car doors, and froze the entire neighborhood in a blanket of silence. That's when Edward made a decision that would change everything. Shovel not only his own driveway, but Mr. Collins's as well. A small act of kindness, nothing more, or so he thought. What followed was a slow unraveling of secrets that had been hidden in plain sight. Behind the old wooden door of Mr. Collins's house lay decades of history, a truth so startling that Edward would later admit it left him shaken to his core. The mysterious man next door was not just a recluse, he was someone far more complex, someone whose past carried shadows darker than the winter nights of New Jersey. And here's the question for you. If you were in Edward's place, would you have dared to cross that snowy driveway? Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable story, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video right now? The mysterious neighbor Edward had been living in New Jersey for over 10 years, yet some mornings still felt foreign to him. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and distant salt from the coast, and the streets lined with neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences seemed almost too perfect. For a British man accustomed to the gray skies and crowded streets of London, the suburbs were a dream, orderly, quiet, and filled with the gentle hum of everyday life. Yet, as comforting as it seemed, there was one house on the block that made Edward's chest tighten with unease. It belonged to Mr. Collins, a man who had lived there longer than Edward had known anyone in the neighborhood, or at least that's what people said. Mr. Collins was the kind of neighbor who didn't just keep to himself. He seemed almost invisible, yet simultaneously, he watched. Curtains were perpetually drawn, the lawn was pristine but oddly bare, and porch lights flickered at odd intervals, never following any predictable pattern. Edward had seen him once or twice from a distance, standing perfectly still in the shadows, as if measuring each passerby with silent judgment. At first, Edward tried to rationalize it. Maybe he's just private, he told himself, sipping his morning coffee as the frost glistened on his driveway. Some people are naturally reserved, especially Europeans or older folks. But Mr. Collins was no ordinary recluse. Neighbors whispered, sharing stories that seemed almost too strange to be true. Lights turning on at odd hours, packages disappearing without explanation, and a gaze that lingered just a moment too long, like a photograph trying to capture a secret. Edward's family, initially cautious, shared the same apprehension. His wife often frowned when passing the house, and his children would quicken their pace when walking past the porch. "Why doesn't he talk to anyone?" his daughter asked one afternoon, her brow furrowed. "He's like a shadow." Edward could only shrug, a mixture of curiosity and unease growing inside him. He knew he needed to understand this man, yet part of him wondered if some things were better left unknown. Winter had a way of amplifying the quiet. Snow would blanket the streets, muting sounds and leaving only the crunch of boots on the frozen sidewalks. One particularly harsh morning, Edward watched as the snow piled high against Mr. Collins's driveway, untouched and obstructing his heavy garage door. Something inside Edward stirred. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was a sense of decency he couldn't ignore. He grabbed his shovel and stepped into the biting cold, determined to clear the snow. Not for recognition, but simply because it felt like the right thing to do. The moment he approached the edge of the property, he saw movement in the window. A brief shadow flickered, and Edward felt a chill run down his spine. The man inside seemed to pause, then retreat from view, almost as if acknowledging Edward's presence without revealing himself. Edward's heart raced. This simple act of shoveling snow suddenly felt like stepping into a world far more complex than his own, a world where the ordinary was entwined with something secretive, perhaps even dangerous. Little did Edward know, this small gesture of kindness would mark the beginning of a connection that would change everything. Mr. Collins, the mysterious neighbor, had layers Edward could never have imagined. Behind the drawn curtains and silent demeanor lay a life full of hidden history, a story waiting patiently for someone to notice. And Edward, whether ready or not, was about to become part of it. Every step he took toward that snow-covered driveway was a step closer to uncovering the truth, a truth that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his quiet suburban life, about neighbors, and about the invisible threads that connect us in ways we never expect. The first suspicion. After that snowy morning, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something about Mr. Collins was off, and it wasn't just the cold or the flickering lights. In the days that followed, every subtle movement in the Collins household seemed magnified. Curtains twitching at the wrong time, shadows lingering in windows, the faint echo of a door closing long after the sun had set. Each detail felt like a piece of a puzzle Edward couldn't yet solve. Edward's neighbors noticed it too. Mrs. Thompson, who had lived across the street for nearly 30 years, whispered over the fence one morning, her voice barely audible over the hum of her snowblower. "He's been here longer than I've been alive, Edward, and I've never seen him smile." Edward nodded politely, trying to hide the unease that tightened around his chest. "Maybe he just likes his privacy," he suggested, though even he felt the words were weak. Then there were the little things that couldn't be ignored. Packages left at the doorstep vanished without explanation. The faint smell of smoke would sometimes waft from the chimney at odd hours, only to disappear minutes later. Even the neighborhood dogs seemed unsettled, barking at nothing and refusing to approach Mr. Collins's gate. Edward, rational and logical by nature, tried to dismiss it all as coincidence, but deep down, he felt the instinctive pull of caution, the kind that warns you when something is not right, even if you cannot name why. Edward found himself paying closer attention during his evening walks. He'd noticed the subtle details others missed, the perfectly aligned garden gnomes, the absence of personal effects on the porch, and the way Mr. Collins would sometimes appear at the window, just a silhouette, seemingly watching Edward's every move. It wasn't menacing, at least not overtly, but it was unsettling. Edward began to wonder, was this man simply private, or was there something else hidden behind that calm exterior? One chilly evening, Edward decided to break the silence. He waved as he passed the driveway, forcing a smile that felt stranger on his face than usual. Mr. Collins didn't respond. He merely nodded once, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, before retreating behind the drawn curtains. Edward felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that the man wasn't openly hostile, but disappointment that his gesture of friendliness had gone almost unnoticed. Despite the uncertainty, Edward couldn't stay away. His curiosity was relentless. He began observing patterns. When the lights flickered, which rooms Mr. Collins seemed to occupy, even the way the wind interacted with the branches near the house. The more Edward noticed, the more he realized that there was a rhythm to the man's life, a quiet precision that didn't align with the casual chaos of the rest of the street. It was as if Mr. Collins operated on a schedule invisible to everyone else, a clock ticking quietly behind the walls of his home. Edward shared his concerns with his family, who were equally fascinated and unnerved. "Do you think he's dangerous?" his son asked one night, the words coming out in a hushed tone. Edward hesitated. "I don't think so. Not in the way you mean," he replied carefully. "But there's something unusual about him, something we don't understand yet." His wife, ever practical, reminded him not to jump to conclusions. "We can't judge someone just because they're different," she said, "but it's fair to be cautious." As days turned into weeks, Edward realized that Mr. Collins's peculiarities were impossible to ignore. They lingered in the air, like the scent of winter pine after a storm, subtle yet unmistakable. Edward became hyper-aware of his surroundings, noticing the way shadows stretched across the Collins property at different times of day, the peculiar sound of a shutter clicking when no one seemed to be there, and the occasional glimpse of movement behind the curtains that seemed deliberate, calculated. By now, Edward had come to an uneasy conclusion. Mr. Collins was not an ordinary neighbor. There was something more beneath the surface, a layer of life hidden from plain sight, guarded meticulously behind the walls of his seemingly quiet home. Edward's instinct told him that the answers, when they came, would be shocking, perhaps even life-changing. And though a part of him feared what he might discover, another part felt compelled to continue, driven by curiosity, empathy, and a growing fascination with the man who remained an enigma in plain sight. Little did Edward know, the first seeds of trust he planted with his small acts of kindness would soon grow into a bond that neither he nor Mr. Collins could have predicted, a bond that would eventually uncover a secret far beyond the imagination of anyone on the quiet and act of kindness. Winter had settled over New Jersey like a thick, silent blanket. Edward had grown accustomed to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, the crunch of snow underfoot, and the occasional chatter of distant children playing in the frost-bitten yards. Yet, despite the serenity, one presence always lingered in his mind. Mr. Collins, the mysterious neighbor whose life seemed locked behind drawn curtains and meticulously kept hedges. The snowstorm had been relentless that morning. By sunrise, every driveway was buried under a thick, icy layer, and Edward's own car struggled to escape the frozen grip of his garage. He shoveled diligently, the rhythm of the work grounding him, when his gaze shifted toward the Collins property. The snow had piled so high against the driveway that it looked impassable. Edward paused, fingers tightening around the wooden handle of his shovel. A small voice inside him, part curiosity, part conscience, whispered that he should do something. Just a little help, he muttered to himself. It won't hurt anyone. Edward trudged across the yard, his boots sinking into the snow, leaving a trail that would later be the only evidence of his approach. The closer he got, the more he noticed the details that made Mr. Collins so unusual. Perfectly aligned garden statues, a mailbox gleaming as though polished hourly, and windows that revealed nothing, hiding every flicker of life within. Edward felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Then came the movement. A shadow flickered behind a frosted window pane, and Edward froze, heart hammering. For a moment he felt the familiar tension of the unknown, the same unease that had kept him cautious for weeks. But it passed almost instantly, replaced by determination. He began shoveling the snow from Mr. Collins' driveway. Each scoop of white, heavy snow seemed to carry away a little of the suspicion that had been gnawing at him. As he worked, Edward felt eyes on him, not the casual glance of a neighbor, but the deliberate observation of someone measuring his every move. He didn't look up, didn't speak. He simply continued, letting the rhythm of the work steady his nerves. After what felt like an eternity, the driveway was cleared, revealing the dark asphalt beneath. Edward stepped back, wiping sweat and snow from his brow, and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. It wasn't long before Mr. Collins appeared. He opened the front door silently, framed in the shadows, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, in a voice low and careful, Mr. Collins said, "Thank you." Edward smiled, brushing off the snow from his gloves. "No problem. Thought you could use a hand," he replied, keeping his tone light even though his heart was still racing. That simple exchange marked the beginning of something extraordinary. In the days that followed, Mr. Collins began to allow small interactions, a nod in passing, a brief word of acknowledgement, a glimpse into a shared smile. Edward learned to recognize the subtle shifts in Mr. Collins's demeanor, the moments when he allowed himself to step out of the shadowed background of his own life. It was through this small act of kindness that Edward began to notice their shared interests. A broken camera lens in Mr. Collins's garage caught Edward's eye one afternoon, and he couldn't resist asking about it. "Photography?" he inquired, genuine curiosity in his voice. Mr. Collins hesitated, then nodded, finally offering a glimpse into a world Edward had never imagined. As it turned out, both men shared a passion for capturing moments. The fleeting beauty of sunlight across a frosted field, the intricate patterns of suburban architecture, the quiet elegance of everyday life. Through shared cameras, lenses, and quiet conversation, the walls that had seemed impenetrable between them began to crumble. Edward realized that Mr. Collins's secrecy wasn't a sign of malice. It was a shield, carefully crafted over years of solitude and careful observation. And yet the same secrecy made every moment of connection all the more precious. The friendship fragile and rare, like a delicate photograph developing slowly in the darkroom of trust. By the end of the week, Edward understood that this small act of shoveling snow had been far more than a gesture of neighborly politeness. It was the first step toward understanding a man who had been an enigma for decades. And as he walked back to his own home that evening, his boots leaving tracks in the soft snow, Edward felt a stirring of anticipation, a sense that the story of Mr. Collins, the mysterious neighbor, was only beginning, and that his own life would never be the same. Discovering common interests. The days following Edward's act of kindness seemed almost ordinary at first, yet, beneath the surface of snow-covered streets and quiet suburban routines, something subtle but powerful was unfolding. Mr. Collins, who had always been a figure shrouded in mystery, was slowly revealing fragments of himself, carefully, cautiously, and only to Edward. It began with a casual conversation over the fence. Edward had noticed a camera strap dangling from Mr. Collins's shoulder as he cleared the snow the previous week. Curiosity nudged him to ask, "You into photography?" Mr. Collins paused, the shadow of a smile flickering across his face. It was the first acknowledgement of shared ground, the first crack in the wall of solitude that had defined him for years. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low but certain. "I've been shooting for a long time." Edward's heart skipped. He had always carried a camera, a habit inherited from his days wandering London streets in search of light and shadow, stories hidden in the mundane. "I shoot too," he replied. "Always have. It's my way of seeing the world." That simple exchange ignited a bond neither had anticipated. Over the next few weeks, Edward found himself visiting Mr. Collins's home under the guise of casual neighborly conversation. They discussed lenses, lighting, and the subtle differences between film and digital. Edward marveled at Mr. Collins's meticulous attention to detail, the precision with which he framed shots, the care in developing photos, the way he could capture the ordinary and make it extraordinary. In return, Edward shared his own perspectives, the playful experimentation he had honed over years of exploring landscapes, city streets, and fleeting human expressions. He noticed, for the first time, how Mr. Collins's reserved demeanor masked an incredible depth of creativity and passion. The walls that had once seemed impenetrable now echoed with shared enthusiasm, laughter, and the quiet thrill of discovery. Their bond deepened not just through photography, but through video. Edward brought over some of his short films, and to his surprise, Mr. Collins watched them with keen interest, offering insights that were both technical and profoundly perceptive. Edward realized that here was a man who had lived a life largely hidden from the world, yet who understood the language of storytelling in a way few others could. It was during one of these sessions that Edward noticed the faint scars on Mr. Collins's hands, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet telling. "You've had a long career in something demanding," Edward ventured cautiously. Mr. Collins merely nodded, the gesture heavy with unspoken history. For the first time, Edward sensed that the mystery surrounding his neighbor ran deeper than eccentricity or preference for solitude. There was a story here, one shaped by discipline, secrecy, and experience beyond the ordinary. Despite the lingering questions, Edward felt a profound sense of trust growing between them. They spent weekends exploring nearby parks, photographing the muted colors of winter, experimenting with light and shadow, and sharing quiet meals over coffee and biscuits. Each interaction peeled back another layer, revealing the man behind the enigma, someone capable of warmth, humor, and an unexpected vulnerability that Edward had never anticipated. Yet, even as their friendship blossomed, Edward couldn't ignore the lingering sense of mystery. Mr. Collins remained careful about his personal life, speaking only in fragments when it came to his past. Edward respected the boundaries, knowing that trust could not be forced, but he also realized that the seeds of curiosity had taken root, growing steadily, subtly, until the questions could no longer be ignored. One afternoon, as the sun slanted across the snow-dappled streets, Edward and Mr. Collins wandered into the woods near the edge of the neighborhood, cameras in hand. They laughed as they captured the frozen branches, the delicate patterns of frost on leaves, and the fleeting beauty of birds braving the winter chill. In that moment, Edward felt a rare sense of peace, a sense that despite the unknowns, despite the unspoken mysteries, he was witnessing the quiet opening of a man who had spent decades guarding himself from the world. It was in these shared experiences, subtle and unremarkable to an outsider, that Edward realized the true power of their growing friendship. Photography and video were not merely hobbies. They were bridges, connecting two men from different worlds, a British immigrant and an enigmatic American neighbor, through shared curiosity, patience, and an appreciation for the world's hidden details. And yet, Edward knew this was only the beginning. Beneath the careful composure of Mr. Collins, beneath the gentle smiles and technical discussions, lay secrets yet to be revealed. Secrets that would eventually test the trust, courage, and perception Edward had cultivated over a decade of life in the United States. The mystery was far from solved, but the bond forged through snow, lenses, and quiet conversation had set the stage for revelations that neither of them could have anticipated. The hidden past. Edward's days with Mr. Collins had settled into a rhythm, quiet but profound. The snow had melted, giving way to the subtle greenness of early spring, and yet the enigma of his neighbor remained. Each moment shared through photography, video, and casual conversation had brought glimpses of Mr. Collins's personality, meticulous, thoughtful, and surprisingly warm. But there was always an invisible barrier, a part of him that remained tightly sealed behind years of habit, discipline, and something Edward could not yet name. It started with small inconsistencies that caught Edward's attention. Bookshelves lined with manuals on strategy and surveillance, framed photographs that seemed strangely staged, and a meticulous record of newspaper clippings, all suggesting a life far more structured and secretive than a casual retiree might possess. Edward tried to piece together these fragments without pressing too hard, aware that Mr. Collins's privacy was sacred, yet curiosity, once sparked, is difficult to extinguish. One afternoon, Edward found himself at Mr. Collins's door, carrying a fresh cup of coffee as a casual gesture of neighborly camaraderie. "Thought you might like a warm drink," Edward said, smiling. Mr. Collins accepted it, nodding slightly, and led Edward to his study, a room Edward had never seen before. The walls were lined with equipment, old cameras, neatly organized reels, and a filing cabinet with labels that hinted at something beyond photography. Edward's eyes widened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Do you mind if I ask?" Edward began cautiously. "All this, is it just for the hobby or is there more?" Mr. Collins paused, a rare flicker of hesitation crossing his face. He poured a second cup of coffee and gestured toward the window, inviting Edward to look outside. "Sometimes things aren't what they seem," he said quietly. "People live their lives carefully, and for reasons you may never understand. But that doesn't mean those lives are empty." Edward nodded, sensing that these words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Over the following weeks, he began noticing more subtle hints of Mr. Collins's hidden past. Occasionally, Edward would see him reviewing old photographs that were oddly precise, sequences of people, streets, and buildings that seemed carefully documented over time. Edward knew instinctively that there was intention behind these images, something that went beyond mere artistic interest. Then came the discovery of a document, small and unassuming, tucked away in a drawer Edward happened to glance into while organizing some film reels. A plaque, engraved and polished to a subtle shine, bore words that stopped Edward's breath for a moment. Over 30 years of dedicated service in an organization whose name he recognized immediately. CIA. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. It was the first concrete proof that Mr. Collins's life was entwined with secrets far greater than mere privacy or eccentricity. The man who had been his neighbor, his companion in photography, and his source of quiet amusement and conversation, had lived an entirely different life before settling into suburban obscurity, a life of missions, of intelligence, of a careful and calculated existence that demanded vigilance and precision. Yet, even with this revelation, Mr. Collins remained enigmatic. He did not boast, nor did he reveal the details of his service. Instead, he continued to live quietly, allowing Edward glimpses of his expertise only through small anecdotes, careful observations, and the meticulous organization of his personal environment. It was clear that the past had shaped him profoundly, instilling habits of observation, discipline, and discretion that defined his every action. Edward began to understand that the hidden past was not merely a collection of secrets, but a lens through which Mr. Collins navigated the world. Every smile, every small gesture, every perfectly framed photograph carried echoes of a life devoted to detail, to observation, and to the unspoken responsibility of guarding knowledge. Edward felt privileged and humbled to witness even fragments of this extraordinary existence. And yet there remained unanswered questions. How much had Mr. Collins truly observed? How deeply had his past influenced the man Edward now considered a friend? The answers were hidden behind walls of discipline and decades of secrecy, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Edward sensed that the truth, when it finally came, would be far more astonishing than anything he could imagine, and that his small acts of kindness, curiosity, and trust were the only keys that could unlock it. As spring days lengthened into warm afternoons, Edward reflected on the delicate balance of friendship and mystery, realizing that the bond between him and Mr. Collins was growing stronger, even as the shadows of the past loomed larger. He understood that life with Mr. Collins was an intricate tapestry of trust, observation, and the quiet acknowledgement of secrets, a tapestry Edward had been unwittingly invited to explore. And though the full story remained hidden, Edward felt a sense of anticipation, knowing that the next chapter in their shared journey would bring revelations capable of shaking the foundation of everything he had believed about the quiet streets of his New Jersey neighborhood, about neighbors and about the extraordinary lives that sometimes lie hidden in plain sight. The big reveal. It was a late afternoon in spring when Edward finally stumbled upon the truth he had sensed all along. The sun slanted through the maple trees, casting elongated shadows across the snowless streets, and the quiet hum of suburban life seemed almost oblivious to the extraordinary revelation about to unfold. Edward had been invited into Mr. Collins's study under the pretext of reviewing some old photography work. But as soon as he stepped inside, he realized that today would be unlike any other. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, an aroma that carried both comfort and the weight of history. Mr. Collins, typically reserved and careful, seemed slightly distracted, almost burdened, as if the air itself carried the gravity of what he was about to disclose. Edward, sensing the unusual tension, settled into a chair, camera resting beside him, unsure whether to speak or wait. Finally, Mr. Collins broke the silence. "Edward," he said, his voice steady but low, "there's something you should know about me. Something I've never shared with anyone in this neighborhood, or perhaps in decades." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "I wasn't always just a quiet neighbor with a passion for photography." Edward leaned forward, heart racing. He had suspected there was more beneath the surface, but nothing could have prepared him for the truth. "I spent over 30 years in the CIA, Mr. Collins continued, his gaze fixed on a stack of old photographs on his desk. "The work was complex, often dangerous. It required discretion, observation, and a constant awareness of the world around me. Some of it you would never believe." Edward's mind spun. The man who had appeared so ordinary, so reserved, had led a life steeped in secrecy, vigilance, and danger. The juxtaposition was startling. The same man who had quietly shared his passion for photography, taught Edward subtle techniques for capturing light and shadow, and occasionally smiled in quiet amusement, had once been immersed in missions that could change the course of nations. Mr. Collins gestured toward a plaque on the wall, polished and engraved with words Edward had glimpsed before, but never truly considered. "This," he said simply, "represents decades of service that I am proud of, though the details remain classified." The words on the plaque confirmed Edward's suspicions. More than 30 years in an organization tasked with intelligence, security, and vigilance beyond the understanding of the average person. Edward felt a mixture of awe, respect, and disbelief. He thought of the quiet precision with which Mr. Collins had lived, the meticulous order in every corner of his home, the careful observation during conversations, and the almost imperceptible ways he had measured every action in his life. Suddenly, everything made sense. The shadows at the windows, the silence in the evenings, the carefully hidden past. It was all the life of a man trained to watch, to act discreetly, and to protect secrets that most people could not even fathom. Yet despite the gravity of the revelation, Edward noticed something equally profound: Mr. Collins's humanity. The man who had once seemed untouchable in his solitude now stood before him, quietly sharing the truth, allowing Edward a glimpse into a world few had ever witnessed. It was a moment of trust that transcended the ordinary, a bridge between mystery and friendship, past and present. Edward realized that the small acts of kindness, the shared interest in photography and video, and the quiet persistence of curiosity had brought him to this point. What had begun as simple neighborly concern had evolved into a connection that revealed extraordinary history, skill, and resilience. Mr. Collins was not merely a retired neighbor. He was a living testament to the power of discretion, dedication, and the hidden complexities of human life. For a long moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words filling the room. Then Edward finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I never would have guessed. You're incredible. All this time you've been here, right next door, and I had no idea." Mr. Collins allowed a faint smile. "Some secrets are meant to be kept, Edward, and some truths only come to those who take the time to notice, to observe, and to care." In that moment, Edward understood that the big reveal was not just about a past life of intrigue and espionage. It was also about trust, friendship, and the courage to see beyond appearances. The mysterious neighbor he had once regarded with curiosity, and perhaps a hint of fear, had become a figure of inspiration, a reminder that even the quietest lives can harbor extraordinary stories. And as Edward left the study that afternoon, stepping into the warm sunlight of the suburban street, he knew the journey was far from over. The hidden past had been unveiled, but the lessons, the legacy, and the deepening friendship with Mr. Collins were only beginning. A new chapter awaited, one that would reveal even more about the man who had spent decades observing the world from the shadows, and the British neighbor who had dared to step into his light. The neighbor's legacy. The following weeks were quiet in the neighborhood, but for Edward, the quiet was heavy with reflection. The revelation of Mr. Collins's past as a CIA operative had transformed his perception of the man. No longer merely a mysterious neighbor, Mr. Collins had become a figure of profound respect, a person whose discipline, dedication, and life of secrecy seemed almost cinematic, yet entirely real. Edward felt privileged to have glimpsed this hidden world, but life, as it often does, carried a bittersweet turn. One morning, Edward noticed that Mr. Collins seemed more fragile than usual. His movements were slower, deliberate, and heavy with fatigue. He brushed it off with a faint smile, claiming minor aches from a long day of organizing his photographs. Edward, however, recognized the subtle signs: pallor, quiet moments of reflection, and an unusual hesitance in conversation. Something was amiss. It was only days later that Edward learned the truth. Mr. Collins had been battling leukemia, a fact he had hidden even from the few he trusted. Edward's heart sank. The man who had shared so much of himself in glimpses, whose life had been a tapestry of secrecy and careful observation, was now facing a battle far more personal and silent. Aware that time was limited, Mr. Collins made a decision that would leave an indelible mark on Edward's life. One afternoon, he invited Edward into his study, the same room where the revelation of his CIA service had occurred. This time, the air was tinged not with mystery, but with a solemn sense of purpose. "Edward," he began, his voice calm yet filled with gravity, "there is something I want you to have. It's not just equipment or belongings. It's a part of me, of the work I've done, and the way I've seen the world." He gestured toward a collection of cameras, lenses, lighting equipment, and meticulously organized video reels. Each item was carefully cataloged, reflecting decades of precision and dedication. Edward's eyes widened. He had handled cameras and film before, but the scale and quality of Mr. Collins's equipment was staggering. These were professional-grade tools, capable of capturing not just images but moments, stories, and histories with unmatched fidelity. And now, they were his. "Why me?" Edward asked quietly, touched and bewildered. "Because you understand," Mr. Collins replied, his gaze steady. "You noticed the details, respected the process, and shared the curiosity that I value. I want these tools, these memories, to continue with someone who can appreciate them, who can see the world through the lens, not just the surface." It was more than a gift. It was a passing of a legacy. Edward felt a profound sense of responsibility. The cameras were not merely instruments, they were vessels of experience, perspective, and silent stories waiting to be told. He realized that in Mr. Collins's hands, they had captured more than light and shadow. They had captured a life of discipline, patience, and dedication. Over the following days, Edward carefully examined each piece of equipment, discovering reels of footage that hinted at the man's extraordinary past. Some were personal, capturing quiet moments of suburban life. Others were clearly professional, revealing meticulous planning, precise framing, and an eye trained to observe without being observed. It was as though Mr. Collins had recorded both his life and the world around him, leaving behind a silent testament to the decades he had spent in vigilance and craft. Amidst this legacy, Edward also found notes, brief annotations in tidy handwriting, reflecting observations, thoughts, and occasional reflections on life, friendship, and trust. These were fragments of wisdom, a map to understanding not just photography or video, but the essence of Mr. Collins himself. Edward realized that through these notes and equipment, the man who had seemed untouchable and mysterious was offering him a bridge into a world both extraordinary and profoundly human. Even as he marveled at the magnitude of the gift, Edward understood its weight. The legacy was not just a collection of objects. It was an invitation, a challenge, and a responsibility. It demanded care, respect, and a commitment to see the world not just as it appeared, but as it could be understood, interpreted, and preserved. And as Edward prepared to take the first steps into this new chapter, he felt a quiet gratitude. The man who had once been a shadow behind drawn curtains, the enigmatic neighbor with a hidden past, had entrusted him with more than cameras and film. He had entrusted him with a story of observation, connection, and the enduring power of kindness and curiosity. Edward knew that this legacy would shape not only his understanding of Mr. Collins, but also his own journey, teaching him that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to look, notice, and carry them forward. Observed, even after Edward had spent days cataloging and organizing the legacy left by Mr. Collins. Every camera, every reel, every meticulously labeled lens told a story of a life lived with precision, care, and an unyielding attention to detail. Yet, despite the magnitude of the gift, there lingered a quiet emptiness, a subtle awareness that something remained hidden, something that only Mr. Collins could have understood. It wasn't until Edward was sorting through an old reel labeled simply Ed that he discovered the truth. The handwriting was crisp, unmistakably Mr. Collins's, and the contents of the reel revealed footage of Edward himself, his daily routines, walks through the neighborhood, moments with his family, all captured with meticulous precision, yet with a sense of care rather than intrusion. At first, Edward froze, unsure whether to feel violated or honored. The realization was overwhelming. Mr. Collins had been observing him all along, even after their friendship had formed, even after Edward had come to trust the enigmatic man. The footage was not intrusive in a malicious sense, rather, it was an extension of the same discipline and observation that had defined Mr. Collins's life, a testament to vigilance, awareness, and a unique perspective on human connection. Edward sat back, heart racing, trying to process the emotions swirling within him. He had always sensed that Mr. Collins's life was layered, complex, and steeped in secrecy. But the revelation that he had been quietly observed, recorded in subtle, thoughtful ways, added an entirely new dimension to the man he had come to admire and respect. It was as if the cameras themselves were a final lesson, a silent reminder of the depth of Mr. Collins's perspective and the extraordinary way he engaged with the world. As Edward continued to watch, he noticed patterns and nuances in the footage that mirrored the lessons he had learned from Mr. Collins in photography and video. The angles, the framing, the careful attention to light and shadow. Every detail reflected a lifetime of practice, experience, and meticulous observation. Edward realized that even in retirement, even in the quiet suburb, Mr. Collins's skills and discipline had never faded. They had merely found a new outlet, one that involved someone he trusted and valued, Edward himself. The realization brought a mix of awe and humility. Edward understood that Mr. Collins had not only been observing him but guiding him in subtle ways, teaching him lessons in perspective, patience, and awareness. The footage became more than just images. It was a record of mentorship, a silent dialogue between two men from different worlds united by curiosity, respect, and a shared appreciation for detail. There was also a profound emotional layer to the revelation. Edward recognized moments of kindness and care in the way the camera captured his daily life, a subtle emphasis on smiles, gestures, and ordinary interactions that highlighted the beauty in the mundane. Mr. Collins had been teaching him, even in silence, that observation was not merely a skill but a way of understanding, appreciating, and connecting with the world. Edward spent hours reviewing the reels, each one revealing new insights, new nuances, and a deeper understanding of the man he had come to call a friend. The revelation was both humbling and inspiring. Mr. Collins's life, his past, his discipline, and his quiet acts of mentorship had created an enduring legacy that transcended ordinary friendship. It was a reminder that extraordinary lives often unfold quietly, invisibly, and that the impact of kindness, attention, and trust can extend far beyond immediate perception. By the time Edward finished watching the last reel, he felt a profound sense of connection, gratitude, and responsibility. He understood that the cameras were not just tools or relics. They were conduits of trust, insight, and the unique vision of a man who had dedicated decades to observation, service, and care. The revelation that he had been observed and taught in subtle, silent ways transformed his understanding of their relationship, deepening it in ways he could not have anticipated. As he stepped outside into the crisp spring air, Edward reflected on the extraordinary journey of discovery, trust, and revelation. Mr. Collins, the mysterious neighbor who had once seemed untouchable, had not only shared his life, his secrets, and his passion, but had also imparted a final lesson: that observation, kindness, and care are powerful forces, capable of shaping lives in profound, enduring ways. And though Mr. Collins was no longer physically present, his guidance, insight, and careful observation continued to influence Edward's life, a silent testament to the extraordinary power of friendship, trust, and the hidden stories that lie just beneath the surface of ordinary suburban life. The final reflection: in the quiet evenings following Mr. Collins's passing, Edward often found himself sitting by the window, gazing at the softly lit streets of his New Jersey neighborhood. The world seemed unchanged. Familiar houses, the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional bark of a dog. Yet Edward's perception had shifted entirely. The ordinary had transformed into something remarkable, imbued with the lessons and legacy of a man who had been far more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. Edward reflected on the journey he had shared with Mr. Collins, beginning with something as simple as shoveling snow from a neighbor's driveway. That single act of kindness had blossomed into an unexpected friendship, revealing layers of complexity, discipline, and trust. What he had initially seen as a mysterious neighbor was, in truth, a man of profound experience, a retired CIA operative whose life had been a delicate balance of observation, secrecy, and dedication. Through their shared passion for photography and video, Edward had glimpsed the intricate patterns of Mr. Collins's mind. Every photograph, every carefully framed shot, every note and reel carried insight into a life built on precision, patience, and meticulous attention to detail. But it was more than skill. It was a philosophy of life. Mr. Collins had taught Edward, quietly and subtly, that seeing beyond the surface, noticing the unseen, and valuing trust and kindness could transform ordinary experiences into meaningful ones. Edward thought about the footage he had discovered, the recordings of his own daily routines, carefully documented with the same precision he had come to admire in his friend's work. At first, he had been startled, even unsettled, to realize that he had been observed. Yet, upon reflection, he understood that Mr. Collins's observation was an expression of care and mentorship, a silent communication of connection and insight. The man had not merely watched. He had guided, taught, and shared a perspective that Edward would carry with him forever. The legacy left to Edward, the cameras, lenses, reels, and notes, was more than material inheritance. It was a gift of vision, of perspective, and of trust. Edward recognized that every item represented decades of experience, wisdom, and discipline. By entrusting them to him, Mr. Collins had passed on a philosophy that attention to detail, patience, and thoughtful observation could shape not only art, but life itself. Edward's reflections often turned inward, considering his own journey as a British immigrant in the United States. He had come seeking opportunity and a new life, never imagining that a simple act of neighborly kindness could lead to a bond so profound, so transformative. He realized that friendship, trust, and generosity were universal forces, transcending culture, nationality, and expectation. Through Mr. Collins, he had discovered not only the extraordinary hidden in an ordinary man, but also the extraordinary potential within himself to see, learn, and grow. He thought about the quiet lessons embedded in every interaction, the patience of sharing a walk through a park, the subtle joy of capturing sunlight on snow, the careful listening during conversations, and the deep respect for boundaries. These were lessons that could not be taught in a classroom or learned from books. They were absorbed through experience, through observation, and through the willingness to engage with someone whose life had been lived largely in secrecy. Even as Edward felt the weight of loss, there was a profound sense of gratitude. Mr. Collins had entrusted him with his life's work, his passions, and a glimpse into a world few could comprehend. The legacy was not simply about cameras or film. It was about understanding, empathy, and the quiet courage to live fully, honestly, and thoughtfully. Edward understood that these were the gifts that would endure, far beyond any physical object or recorded memory. As evening settled into night, Edward found himself speaking softly to the memory of his friend. "Thank you, Collins," he whispered, "for everything, for the lessons, the trust, and the example." He felt a sense of peace, knowing that Mr. Collins's impact would continue to guide him, not only in photography and video, but in life itself. Edward realized that the story of his mysterious neighbor was ultimately a story about humanity, about kindness, curiosity, trust, and the enduring bonds that can form when we open ourselves to others without expectation. It was a story that transcended mystery and secrecy, revealing the extraordinary power of connection and the quiet, transformative influence one person can have on another. And as Edward gazed out at the softly lit streets, he resolved to honor that legacy every day, to see the world with attention and care, to nurture curiosity, to embrace kindness, and to understand that even in the ordinary, the extraordinary is waiting to be discovered. The lessons of Mr. Collins would live on in him, a silent guiding presence shaping every photograph, every observation, and every choice. The last lesson. Spring had fully arrived in New Jersey, filling the streets with the gentle hum of life, children laughing in yards, neighbors exchanging greetings, and sunlight glinting off the newly blossomed leaves. Yet for Edward, the world outside carried a deeper resonance than before. The story of Mr. Collins, his mysterious neighbor with a hidden past, had left an indelible mark on his life. Each moment, each lesson, and each revelation had shaped Edward's understanding of friendship, trust, and the quiet power of human connection. Even after Mr. Collins had passed, his presence lingered in subtle ways. The cameras and equipment he had entrusted to Edward were not just tools. They were windows into the mind of a man who had lived a life defined by observation, precision, and dedication. The reels of footage, the meticulously labeled notes, and the thoughtfully organized lenses carried lessons far beyond photography. Lessons about patience, discipline, and the impact one person can have on another. Edward often found himself reflecting on the journey from the day he first shoveled snow from Mr. Collins's driveway. What had seemed like a simple act of neighborly kindness had blossomed into a profound friendship, revealing a life far richer and more extraordinary than Edward could have imagined. Mr. Collins had lived decades in secrecy and service, yet he had chosen to share fragments of his world with Edward, trusting him with insights, tools, and memories that would shape his understanding forever. What struck Edward most was the quiet humanity behind the mystery. Mr. Collins had been more than a retired operative or a skilled photographer. He had been a mentor, a guide, and a friend. Through subtle observation and careful interaction, he had taught Edward to notice the unnoticed, to appreciate detail, and to recognize the extraordinary within the ordinary. The footage of Edward's own life, recorded with precision and care, had become a testament to this quiet mentorship, a reminder that guidance sometimes comes in unexpected forms. As Edward arranged the final reels and reflected on the story that had unfolded over months, he realized that Mr. Collins's greatest gift was not the equipment, nor even the glimpses into a secretive past. It was the lesson of perspective, trust, and generosity. To see the world carefully, to value human connection, and to offer kindness without expectation, these were the truths that would endure long after the mystery had been revealed. Edward felt a deep sense of gratitude for the friendship that had transformed an ordinary neighborhood into a landscape of extraordinary experience, for the trust that had allowed him to step into a life hidden for decades, and for the subtle guidance that had taught him to observe, learn, and appreciate life in new ways. Mr. Collins had shown him that even the quietest lives, lived with care and intention, could leave lasting impacts, stories that could inspire, teach, and change others. And so, as Edward stood by the window one evening, watching the golden light of sunset filter through the trees, he reflected on the ultimate lesson. Life is full of hidden stories, silent mentors, and unexpected bonds. The ordinary streets of his New Jersey neighborhood were now filled with memory, perspective, and the echoes of a friendship that had bridged secrecy, culture, and experience. Edward knew that the story did not end here. Every photograph he took, every video he created, carried the imprint of Mr. Collins's guidance. Every choice he made was colored by the lessons of observation, patience, and trust. And every act of kindness he extended to others was a tribute to the man who had taught him that even the smallest gestures can lead to extraordinary connections. Before ending the day, Edward turned to the camera with a gentle smile, ready to share the story with the world. "So what did you think of this story?" he asked warmly. "On a scale from 0 to 10, what score would you give it?" He paused, letting the question linger, inviting reflection and conversation. And if you want to hear more incredible emotional stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We'll explore even more tales of mystery, friendship, and unexpected discoveries. Edward leaned back, feeling a sense of peace. The journey with Mr. Collins had transformed him, leaving lessons, memories, and a legacy that would continue to guide him every day. And as the night settled over the quiet streets, he knew that extraordinary stories were all around, waiting to be noticed, understood, and shared. The legacy of a mysterious neighbor, a retired operative, and a quiet mentor had become a living testament to the power of kindness, observation, and the bonds that connect us all. And now, Edward was ready to carry it forward. One story, one photograph, and one lesson at a time. Thank you for watching this story. What did you think of it? On a scale from 0 to 10, what score would you give it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more emotional and incredible stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll be sharing more amazing tales very soon.